Welcome. I'm Dave Deville. I'm co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. I'm the editor of Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture, and a visiting professor at the University of St. Thomas. I'll be your host today for our continuing webinar series with our faculty members presenting research that they've done that contributes to the mission of the Murphy Institute and the Center for Catholic Studies. The Murphy Institute, if you don't know it, is an institute which is a collaboration between the Center for Catholic Studies and the University of St. Thomas School of Law. Our intention is to bring out issues of intellectual and public life and address both the elements of Catholic teaching and intellectual thought, as well as the legal issues in them. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Kenneth W. Kemp to our webinar series. Dr. Kemp is a professor emeritus of philosophy here at the University of St. Thomas. He's a prolific author of articles on ethics, and particularly military and just war ethics, as well as the history and the philosophy of science. Dr. Kemp has a long background. He has a military background as well as a background in Russian language and literature. He had degrees from University of Texas as well as Georgetown University. And he has a doctorate in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Notre Dame. As I said, he's an accomplished scholar, and he's also been a valuable friend and ally of lots of people looking to do the work of the Murphy Institute here at the University of St. Thomas. For many years, I'll just note that he was the organizer of our summer faculty seminars, which brought together a number of faculty from disparate disciplines for a week or two to talk about important issues. Many of them that Ken organized had to do with science and religion, but many of them had to do with many other subjects like Christian humanism, Newman's idea of the university, and various other things. He also was the lead organizer for many years of the trip that we had for undergraduate and graduate students to go down to the fall conference of the Notre Dame De Nicolas Center for Ethics and Culture. And that brings us to another topic, that Ken's gift for languages and scholarship, which allows him to do such great work. He is currently the author of the new book, The War That Never Was, about the purported battle between religion and science. He also is, importantly, the translator of the late Cardinal Joseph Zyszyński's God and Evolution, which is about fundamental questions of Christianity and science. That talent for translation is something that I admire about Dr. Kemp. I don't know how many languages he speaks, but it's many. And I recall that during one trip down to Notre Dame with students, Dr. Kemp had as a fellow chaperone another one of the philosophy professors, an adjunct professor, and he was learning Lithuanian verbs. And after about 5 hours of that, she began to scream and suggested that they play something, anything, Smashing Pumpkins. But it testifies to his ability to learn languages and learn culture and to learn things deeply. Today, he'll be talking about the question of religion and science, particularly in public school education. How is it that public school teachers who teach on the topic of evolution can deal with religious questions and particularly dissent on questions of evolution? Dr. Kemp is going to talk for about a half hour or so. He has a wonderful slide presentation. At the end of his slide presentation, I will be rejoining the feed and we'll be taking questions. So if you can find on your bar for the webinar, the Q&A button, you can insert your questions there and I'll be taking questions from that. We'll see if we can take as many questions as possible. So for now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kemp to give his presentation.
As Dr. Deville mentioned, I recently published a book entitled The War That Never Was, in which I argued that there's never been a war between science and religion over evolution. The attempt to construct the idea, I want to say the myth, that there has been a war between science and religion over evolution is built on three mistakes. First, it presupposes that the line between between scientific matters and theological matters is fairly clear. In fact, the lines are not clear. They've needed to be drawn and sometimes redrawn in light of new concepts and new knowledge. Second, although there have, to be sure, been wars over evolution, the belligerents were not precisely science and religion. One war was waged between evolutionists and anti-evolutionists, often within particular churches as much as without. The other is a battle between Christians and atheists who have tried to use good scientific theory as a tool in their promotion of a bad philosophical one. One component of that latter battle is an attack by diehard and mostly Christian anti-evolutionists, sometimes on the paleoetiological sciences in general, that is, the sciences of ancient causes like historical geology, and sometimes just on evolutionary biology. The other component is an attack by militant atheists using laboratory coats as a kind of camouflage on Christianity. Finally, the aggressors, when the term is appropriate at all, are not always those who are presented as being the religious side. Sometimes, to be sure, the source of the problem is the unreflective conservatism of theologians or other religious believers who, as their fellow believers often point out to them, have mistaken theological opinions about the truths of revelation. This unreflective conservatism is sometimes included intemperate attacks, both rhetorical and political, on science. At other times, however, the source of the problem is rather the aggressive scientism, agnosticism, or atheism of scientists or of science enthusiasts who fail to distinguish between the genuine fruit of scientific inquiry and the naturalistic or atheistic philosophy in which they manage to entangle it. This entanglement often leads to scientistic or otherwise uninformed attacks on religious doctrines or even on religion itself. Though there was not a war between religion and science, it is true that some anti-evolutionists continue to fight against evolutionary components of the public school curriculum and do so as a consequence of their religious beliefs. The first of two great curriculum wars over the place of evolution in the curriculum of American public schools lasted less than 10 years. Launched by William Jennings Bryan and others in 1921 to prohibit the teaching of the evolutionary origins of man in public schools and universities. Controversy seemed to quiet down by 1928 after the passage by referendum of a Bryan law in Arkansas. A combination of factors led to the outbreak of a second curriculum war in the 1960s. The first factor was a new high school science curriculum stimulated by the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Second was a new approach to anti-establishmentarian jurisprudence begun in the 1947 New Jersey bus case and brought to bear on our topic in 1968 when the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Bryan laws unconstitutional. Third was a revival of flood geology with the publication of John C. Whitcomb and Henry Morris, with the publication of their book, The Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record and its Scientific Implications. That was in 1961. That second war was different from the first in its more comprehensive anti-evolutionism. In the first years of the Second War, anti-evolutionists tried to secure inclusion in the public school curricula of a young earth anti-evolutionism, which they called creation science. Later, the focus was on inclusion of intelligent design theory. There's a quick account of creation science. Later, the focus was on the inclusion of intelligent design theory, an age-neutral attack on natural selection. This second curriculum war has continued for nearly half a century now with no real sign of an end in sight. In my judgment, both modern kinds of anti-evolutionism are mistaken in their claims about the weaknesses of evolutionary biology and about the scientific merits of their own theories. But I think that we should also recognize that the partisans of evolutionary biology sometimes overstate their own case and fail to distinguish between scientific results and philosophical ideas, in particular when it comes to the question of human origins. In any case, I think that we need to recognize that the religious dimensions of anti-evolutionism, a dimension on which the evolutionists sometimes insist even more strongly than do the anti-evolutionists themselves, the religious dimensions entitle it to a kind of deference in the spirit of the First Amendment that it does not always receive. Walter Lippmann, who opposed passage of the anti-evolutionist Bryan laws during the first curriculum war, recognized the importance of this principle in 1928 and gave Bryan his Jeffersonian due. Lippmann wrote, Bryan asked whether, if it's wrong to compel people to support a creed they disbelieve, it's not also wrong to compel them to support teaching which impugns the creed in which they do believe. Jefferson had insisted in his bill for establishing religious freedom in 1779 that the people should not have to pay for the teaching of Anglicanism. Mr. Bryan asked why they should be made to pay for the teaching of agnosticism. I think that the spirit of the First Amendment requires, and sound educational practice justifies, a prefatory word about the alleged connections between evolution and various religious doctrines held by some of our fellow citizens. While it is true that 2 local attempts to implement such a solution were blocked by federal courts, the question of whether any such prefatory statement would be permissible is still an open legal question. Here, at the heart of today's talk, I want to review the legal history of this solution and to suggest that a statement more carefully crafted than those used in the previous attempts to implement the solution might well pass constitutional muster and more generally provide a solution acceptable to all reasonable people. To the objection that the whole problem is that too many of the principles on both sides of this debate are precisely not reasonable people, I have no particular answer beyond hoping that this is not so. So let's turn to history. Case 1, Freiler versus Tangipahoa Parish Board of Education. First case rose in Tangipahoa Parish. Parish means county in Louisiana, so it's not a parochial school, it's public schools. In the first case arose in Louisiana, where the parish school board on the 19th of April, 1994, by a vote of 5-4, instructed teachers to read the following disclaimer at the beginning of each relevant unit of instruction. It's hereby recognized by the Parish Board of Education that the lesson to be presented regarding the origin of life and matter is known as the scientific theory of evolution and should be presented to inform students of the scientific concept and not intended to influence or dissuade the biblical version of creation or any other concept. It's further recognized by the Board of Education that it's a basic right and privilege of each student to form his or her own opinion or maintain beliefs taught by parents on this very important matter of the origin of life and matter. Students are urged to exercise critical thinking and gather all information possible and closely examine each alternative toward forming an opinion. Shortly after the school board acted, but before the policy was implemented, several parents of children in the parish public schools challenged the measure in federal court as an establishment of religion in violation of both federal and state constitutions. District Court Judge Marcel Livaudet said that, try as he might, he could discern no secular purpose for the disclaimer. Without such a purpose, the measure failed the first prong of the Lemon test, which federal courts commonly apply in such cases. Although a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals identified 2 secular purposes, it judged the disclaimer unconstitutional on the basis of its primary effect, or more or less equivalently, for failing the endorsement test. The court said the primary effect of the disclaimer is to protect and maintain a particular religious viewpoint, namely belief in the biblical version of creation. The disclaimer, taken as a whole, encourages students to read and meditate upon religion in general and the biblical version of creation in particular. That school board petition, or the school board petitioned for a rehearing en banc, but the petition was denied, a decision from which 7 of the circuit judges dissented. Circuit Judge Barksdale, writing for the dissenters, argued that the primary effect of the disclaimer is to advance tolerance and respect for diverse viewpoints. To the overwhelming majority of the parish students, the scientific concept of evolution conflicts with their or their parents' beliefs about the origin of life and matter. And its exclusive place in the curriculum had caused concern among students and parents. The disclaimer's message is one of respect for diverse viewpoints, informing students that the teaching of evolution is the sole concept for the origin of life and matter, is not intended to influence or dissuade them from forming their own opinions about the subject or from maintaining beliefs taught by their parents. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case, prompting Justice Antonin Scalia to add in his dissent, "We stand by in silence while a deeply divided Fifth Circuit bars a school district from even suggesting to students that other theories besides evolution, including but not limited to the biblical theory of creation, are worthy of their consideration." So, second case out of Georgia, Rosen Cobb County, where in 2002, the school board was in the process of revising the school curriculum in a way that would give the theory of evolution more prominence than it had hitherto received in the county schools. Although this would bring the curriculum into compliance with state guidelines, it would certainly be unpopular with the county's many anti-evolutionist parents. In order to effect a compromise, the school board proposed to paste onto all relevant textbooks a sticker which said, "This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered." Again, evolutionists and transigents challenged the compromise in court as an establishment of religion. In 2004, the district court found for the plaintiffs and ordered the school board to remove the offending stickers as impermissible under the effect prong of the Lemon test and the endorsement test. The sticker sends a message to those who oppose evolution for religious reasons, that sends a message that they're favored members of the political community, while the sticker sends a message to those who believe in evolution that they're political outsiders. One might have thought that it would have been a school board selection of a textbook that included a 101-page defense of evolution that constituted an endorsement, and not the 30-word concession to the anti-evolutionist losers in the fight over curriculum. But federal court Judge Clarence Cooper saw it differently. The school board took the case to the 11th District Court of Appeals, but so much of the crucial evidence had in the interim gone inexplicably missing that the appellate judges saw no alternative but to vacate the decision and to remand the case to the district court for rehearing. Shortly thereafter, the school board, while continuing to maintain the constitutionality of the stickers, decided that the distraction and expense involved made continued litigation unwise. The stickers having already been removed, the school board agreed not to replace them with any similar stickers and to pay a portion of plaintiffs' legal fees. So that's the history. Now I want to make a proposal for compromise. The second curriculum war, whatever its larger nature, is still a social problem and one that does some harm both to science education and to religion. Although it's sometimes thought to be intractable, it is, in fact, I think, possible to articulate a prefatory statement that would alleviate some of the tension and respect the most important concerns of all sides. Although earlier attempts to implement such a solution have not fared well in the courts in which they've been challenged, these decisions have little precedential value. One was vacated by a higher court, the other explicitly stated that it did not confront the broader issue of whether the reading of any disclaimer before the teaching of evolution would amount to an unconstitutional establishment of religion. Statements to students of the kind attempted in Tangipahoa Parish and Cobb County have so far been declared unconstitutional only with reference to the wording and context of the particular cases. As Judge Ed Carnes put it in one of the cases, factual context is everything. So a more carefully written statement might still pass legal muster. School boards will continue to face the problem of implementing a curriculum that's not only pedagogically responsible in its presentation of the results of modern scientific research, but respectful of the religious views of anti-evolutionists. So with such school boards in mind, I offer my thoughts on armistice terms that might be offered to the warring parties. Schools, I propose, can begin their presentation of evolutionary biology by acknowledging in an explicit statement to students the following 8 principles. First, scientific research can only establish the powers of nature. Even on that, its conclusions, though often highly likely, are at best only probable. This requires several points of comment. First, what are the powers of nature? What does the powers of nature mean? By this, I mean only what underlies the laws of nature, gravitation and inertia at the level of physics, and growth, appetite, and perception at the biological level. Second, what's excluded by the only. Science can tell us what nature can do, but not what can be done to it from the outside. I'll return to this point below. Third, can science not also tell us something about the history of natural objects? Sometimes the effects of certain processes allow us to reconstruct the history of what happened. It's hard to burn down a building without leaving telltale features that tip the arson investigator off as to what has happened. So in nature, the geographical distribution of organisms, combined with what we know about comparative morphology, migration, and natural selection, allows us to reconstruct the history of life. Fourth, why are the conclusions of scientific research only probable? Because science works by proposing and then testing the best available explanation of whatever phenomenon is under investigation. In addition to general human fallibility, to which even mathematics is vulnerable, there are two particular features of the scientific method that make its reasoning inherently merely probable. First, new evidence might turn up, evidence which falsifies a hitherto highly plausible theory. Second, a new and better explanation might occur to someone, and I need an idea no one had thought of until then. Next, science has shown to the satisfaction of most scientists that natural processes could have shaped the geological column, originated new species from one or a few first kinds of living thing, and given rise to the human body. That science has done this to the satisfaction of most scientists is a sociological fact. It helps us to see why students should know something about the paleoetiological sciences, their contents, and the arguments in their favor, whether the students agree with those scientific theories or not. Next, science has not yet provided a fully developed account of how living things could have arisen by natural processes in a world without life, though that failure does not show that life could not have so arisen. For too many people, the word evolution calls to mind the idea of a cosmical process, one and continuous from nebula to man, from star to soul, from atom to society. There have been, to be sure, thinkers who have advanced such a cosmic vision of the world. This was done in a materialistic way by German biologist Ernst Haeckel and by English philosopher Herbert Spencer in the 19th century. It was done in a relatively materialistic way. It was done in a spiritualistic way by French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard in the 20th. In developing their worldviews, however, Haeckel, Spencer, and Teilhard went far beyond drawing conclusions from scientific evidence. To the extent that an evolutionary history of the cosmos can be told as a scientific story, it's not so much the story of one continuous process as it is a composite of distinct connectable theories, from the Big Bang through a somewhat Laplacian theory of the origin of the solar system, to a somewhat Lyellian geology, to a somewhat Darwinian account of the origin of species. Although these distinct theories must be consistent with one another, and to the extent that they actually connect with one another, must do so smoothly, each stands or falls on the basis of a distinct body of evidence. Evidence for the evolutionary origin of species does nothing to support Big Bang theory, and the latter theory is entirely immune from attacks on the former. It's simply a fact that scientists have not been able to muster powerful scientific arguments in favor of any particular account of the origin of life. Arguments, to be sure, there have been. Atheists might ask what else could have brought forth living cells in a merely chemical, that is, organism-free world. Christian naturalists in the tradition of Belgian priest geologist Henri de Dorlodot might argue that the world which God created does seem to work in that kind of way. But those are philosophical or theological arguments, not scientific ones. The gap left by the inability of scientists to figure out how life began does not, as Darwin, to pick an early example, recognized, affect the soundness of Darwin's argument for the evolutionary origin, or to be more precise, the differentiation of individual species. Next point. Whether science has shown that natural processes could have given rise to fully human beings depends in part on whether human beings are purely material beings or whether they are beings with immaterial souls. At first, this seems to be just a logical point following from the standard conception of the nature of science. On reflection, however, one might notice the related point that science so far has nothing to say even about the grounds of consciousness, that is, about how brain states give rise to sensations, perceptions, and emotions, much less abstract ideas. Fifth point, science cannot establish either whether human beings have immaterial souls or whether there exists anything outside of nature that could be causally responsible for some aspects of the natural world, for example, by creation or by miracle. These last 2 points go together. That is this in the fourth. There is, to be sure, room for controversy over the exact boundary of religious as opposed to other beliefs. But it seems clear that at least the existence of souls is not a scientific question. Here's Stephen Jay Gould. Science cannot touch such a subject and therefore cannot be threatened by any theological position on such a legitimately and intrinsically religious issue, namely the infusion of souls into material bodies. If science cannot answer the question of whether human beings have a spiritual component, then science cannot give a complete answer to the question of the origin of man. At most, it can give an answer to the origin of the material component, man, that is, of the human body. Sixth point, an argument that natural objects could have been or even were produced by natural powers does not resolve one way or the other the question of whether there exists anything outside of nature, for example, a being which created the natural world itself. I won't elaborate on this point beyond saying that I think it's a consequence of my first point listed separately, the sixth one listed separately here for emphasis. Seventh point, if there's anything outside of nature that could be causally responsible for some aspects of the natural world, then an argument that nature could produce some effect would not be sufficient to determine whether it did so. Resolution of such a question might require resolution of certain theological questions as well as of scientific ones. Any miracle claim will be sufficient to illustrate this point. Let's take the miracle performed at the wedding feast at Cana. No Christian would deny that good wine, even presumably wine better than the wine served first, can be produced by the natural processes of grape fermentation. The claim that the wine at Cana was produced miraculously is based on the bare possibility of miracles, eyewitness testimony, and the reliability of Scripture. Those are theological theses beyond the reach of scientific adjudication. Some determined, if benighted atheists, have, to be sure, argued that such a possibility, that is, possibility of miracles, undermines the possibility of science. Richard C. Levantine, for example, once wrote that either the world of phenomena is a consequence of the regular operation of repeatable causes and their repeatable effects, or else at every instant all physical regularities may be ruptured and a totally unforeseeable set of events may occur. One must take sides on the issue of whether the sun is sure to rise tomorrow. We cannot live simultaneously in a world of natural causation and of miracles. For if one miracle can occur, then there is no limit. C.S. Lewis offered, I think, an effective reply. The laws of nature, Lewis wrote, will tell you how a billiard ball will travel on a smooth surface if you hit it in a particular way, but only provided no one interferes. If after it's already in motion, someone snatches up a cue and gives it a biff on one side, why, then you won't get what the scientist predicted. In the same way, if there was anything outside nature and if it interfered, then the events which the scientist expected wouldn't follow. That would be what we call a miracle. But it isn't the physicist who can tell you how likely I am to catch up a cue and spoil his experiment with a billiard ball. You'd better ask a psychologist. And it isn't the scientist who can tell you how likely nature is to be interfered with from outside. You must go to the metaphysician. I discussed this in some detail in a paper entitled Scientific Method Supernatural Agency, which I published in Logos about 20 years ago. So, eighth point, the evaluation of religious and theological questions is not methodologically appropriate in the science classroom and is not politically appropriate in American public schools. There are 2 points to elaborate here, but both require only brief comment. Methodological inappropriateness is partly a consequence of my sixth point, and partly of the fact that there's enough work to do in the science classroom without taking up questions to answer which would require use of an entirely different method. Of course, I do not want to be dogmatically purist about that. Students do need to think about how to integrate all that they know and about the world into a unified whole. More important is perhaps the second point, the political inappropriateness of taking up theological questions in the public school classroom. Surely a society embroiled in interminable disputes about the permissibility of placing a Christmas crest in a public park or an image of the Ten Commandments in a courtroom can recognize the greater problematicity of having the high school teachers taking up questions of whether man has any material soul. Would a statement containing the 8 points I just proposed pass the 3 prongs of the Lemon test? That test requires the statute must have a secular legislative purpose, that its principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion, and that the statute must not foster an excessive government entanglement with religion. I do not want to endorse Lemon's approach to Establishment Clause jurisprudence. I think that many of the things that Justice Scalia and others have said against it are cogent. It's nevertheless a good test for my purpose here, since it was a test used by the lower courts that struck down the statements used in Cobb County and Tangipahoa Parish. I think a statement along the lines I've presented will pass that test. First, use of the statement would have a secular purpose. Lemon's first prong does not require that challenged state action have been enacted in furtherance of exclusively or even predominantly secular objectives. A sincere secular purpose for the contested state action must exist, even if that secular purpose is but one in a sea of religious purposes. Although inquiry into the purpose of legislation is by its nature inquiry into a particular legislative act, there's no reason to think that the statement outlined above could not be made for a secular purpose. In Freiler, the Court of Appeals acknowledged that local school boards need not turn a blind eye to the concerns of students and parents troubled by the teaching of evolution in public classrooms, and that the dual objectives of disclaiming orthodoxy of belief and reducing student-parent offense are permissible secular objectives that the school board could rightly address. Second, the principal or primary effect would be the reduction of the political tensions in public education by respecting the rights of a religious minority and to give students some idea of the limits of scientific reasoning. That'll do nothing to advance religion among irreligious or religiously indifferent students. Indeed, it seems only to respond to a principle laid down in Lynch versus Donnelly, a case holding that a city creche, being a depiction of the historical origins of the upcoming legal holiday, had a legitimate secular purpose. That court said the Constitution affirmatively mandates accommodation, not merely tolerance, of all religions and forbids hostility toward any. I'm not convinced by all the aspects of the court's reasoning in Freiler, but my own statement being different from Tangipahoa Parish's statement, that decision would not have to be neglected by a court that upheld the use of the statement I proposed. In Freiler, the appellate court said, we conclude that the primary effect of the disclaimer is to protect and maintain a particular religious viewpoint, namely belief in the biblical version of creation. In reaching this conclusion, we rely on the interplay of 3 factors: the juxtaposition of the disavowal of endorsement of evolution with an urging that students contemplate alternative theories of the origin of life. Second, the reminder that students have the right to maintain beliefs taught by their parents regarding the origin of life. And third, the biblical version of creation is the only alternative theory explicitly referenced in the disclaimer. So that was the objection of the court. My statement, while acknowledging that there might be something outside of nature, including immaterial souls, does not encourage students to read and meditate upon religion in general and the biblical version of creation in particular, or to consider religious alternatives to evolution a part of the state mandated curriculum. There's no danger of students and parents perceiving that the school board endorses religion specifically those creeds that teach the biblical version of creation. Finally, use of the statement in public school classrooms would not foster an excessive government entanglement with religion, as no particular religion and no particular religious text is mentioned. Such a statement will surely not satisfy all anti-evolutionists. Some do claim that there are scientific objections to natural selection, or even to any form of evolutionary biology and historical geology, though few scientists agree. To that objection, I would make two replies. First, it does seem to me that much of the enthusiasm for creation science and the intelligent design movement is driven more by religious concerns than by purely scientific interest in, say, the origin of bacterial flagella. Second, that the spirit and indeed the letter of the First Amendment gives a special status to specifically religious concerns beyond anything that must be accorded to merely scientific dissent. It was they, that is, religious concerns, not scientific ones about epicycles or phlogiston, that caused political turmoil in early modern Europe. It's not hard to understand why this is so. Such an acknowledgement, I believe, would give anti-evolutionist Christians a religious deference that they're owed under the Constitution, without in any way giving special status to anti-evolutionist versions of Christianity, or casting undue doubt on what many people judge to be the real accomplishments of those working in the paleo-etiological sciences. To be sure, the aggressive measures taken by the anti-evolutionist organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Center for Science Education remind school boards of the costs of trying to diffuse local controversy in this way. The idea that freedom of religion must accommodate religion they don't like is apparently not a principle that these organizations recognize. Perhaps at least the principles which I articulated could be of some use, even in private hands. So those are my thoughts on the topic. I'll be interested in hearing other people's thoughts or questions.
All right. Thank you, Ken. We do have a number of questions. That was fantastic. One of the first ones that's in the chat box is, will you be able to make this PowerPoint available, or do you have an article in which you've laid this out published yet?
Everything's available in the sense that it's a file, which I'm willing to share. I haven't published it yet. I thought of putting it in the book, and then I thought, no, the book is more about history. Maybe I'll publish it when the book is out to draw attention to the book, but I haven't quite done it yet. But I can talk to Murphy Institute, and maybe they can make it.
We can make that available. That'd be
some kind of way.
fantastic.
Okay.
Another question in there. Well, I guess let me say it's not a question, but it's just a comment. This is great. Thank you. So appreciation there. If any of you have more questions too, I'm monitoring the Q&A box. Third question, as one wants to know about any current court cases or anything past Kitzmiller versus Dover. Or do you have a sense of any cases that are going through, or any lower court decisions that are wending their way up?
I don't know of any. I try to a certain extent to watch it, but not as closely as other people might. Probably the best place to look for that's a National Center for Science Education on their website. They keep up with all of these things, and I don't know the URL, but if you type it into a search engine, it'll.
That's the National Center for Science Education?
Yes.
All right, that's great. Another question relating to Kitzmiller versus Dover. For your purpose, primary effect prong, how do you answer the endorsement test concerns of Kitzmiller versus Dover? As there, the federal district court held that a reasonable observer would understand intelligent design to be a veil for Christianity. Would your disclaimer not similarly be a veil for a religion that everybody really knows is Christianity?
Well, first you might say, to say Christianity is too narrow. I mean, Jews and Muslims seem to be implicated in this also. That is, they have the same general anthropology and same general theology. So not narrowly Christianity. Somebody might say, well, okay, then theism. It's, or maybe a particular kind of the monotheistic triad or something like that. one of the problems with in Dover was that they presented in a certain way a particular book that was on offer to students, and surely the book was put in the library of the school in many copies. I don't think they got any further than that.
Was this an intelligent design book?
It was an intelligent design book, pandas
Okay.
and people or something like that.
Yeah.
I guess I do think that the court sometimes push the idea of endorsement too far. And as I tried pretty explicitly to say only that things that are simply true, and I think not especially controversial, that science is fallible, that most scientists think that the evolutionary theory of the origin of species is true, that they haven't solved the problem of the origin of life. Those things seem not to be false and not particularly controversial. So I don't see that it should be seen as a disguised endorsement of a particular religion, merely an acknowledgement that some people have concerns here. And so, I mean, I guess we could read through Kitzmiller again. I know that a quick passage was just read there, but we could look at the arguments for it in detail. And anyway, Kitzmiller is not absolutely binding. It's a federal district court. The case did not go any further.
Mm-hmm. So do you know if there are other districts that have similar books made available from the Intelligent Design School or other alternate theories? Or
I don't know of any particular school district that did. I mean, I suppose it'd be one thing to stick a copy of a book in the library, but Dover went rather beyond it. There were lots of copies of the book in the library, and so they did. I mean, it seemed to me that Dover did endorse intelligent design in a way that my statement does not do. Now, endorse, it seemed to endorse anyway. So I think that you can make a distinction between what I did and a particular way that Dover approached intelligent design.
Now, maybe to go from the other side, what kind of success do you imagine your proposal would have among scientists? I mean, you noted that many of the problems come from scientists who are delving into philosophical and theological issues, perhaps to mirror the language of Kitzmiller versus Dover, under the veil of talking about science. They're doing scientism and not strictly science. Do you think that your proposal would be successful on a broad scale?
Well, I mean, one can always be hopeful. I suppose that's distinct from the way you put it. Would I expect that it will be successful? I mean, I suppose anything that one tries to do to solve this is going to create some risk of a fight. There are, I mean, there are, as I said halfway through, they're kind of angry and what's a nice word to say about it? People love to fight about these things on both sides. I mean, go look at BBC a couple of years ago did a long article on origins of life. It's still up, and then the article has some strengths as a review of the what scientists have proposed and the problems that the theories have and so on. But at one point it says pretty flatly, the idea of immaterial souls is just a version of vitalism, and vitalism is false. I mean, it's there are people that are convinced of this kind of thing and might resist it, but they seem to be reasonable terms, and maybe the reasonable people will be able to prevail and give its due to each side. That's what I was attempted to do.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have a question from an attendee who wants to know about the practice of historical critical methods of biblical criticism show that there are multiple creation accounts in Genesis, and that these are stories written by ancient authors in Israel who were not documenting a scientific approach to creation, but who were articulating their views as distinct from Babylonian stories, for example, that their God was behind all of creation. If schools are allowed to teach intelligent design, are they not misleading students about what scholars of Christianity are saying about the biblical accounts?
Well, intelligent design people would probably say that they're not vulnerable to that charge because they are offering a philosophical argument about, well, they say scientific argument, but at least, if not that, at least a philosophical argument. That is, they tried to avoid discussion of the biblical text, and the way that creation science people in the end did not. I mean, that is, they'll say, well, we're just going to give scientific evidence for these things, but the thing is their ideas are very closely aligned with a very particular view. So I think teaching intelligent design is problematic. Yes, my proposal didn't accommodate that. It was merely an attempt to keep evolutionary ideas in the curriculum without running roughshod over people whose theological views I think are mistaken. So, I mean, I in general agree with that idea about how one should understand Genesis, but I think that cannot be discussed in the public schools. That it, I mean, that's a religious matter, and it keeps the peace to not take it up into schools.
I'm wondering if the questioner perhaps heard you say, well, it's in certain ways unavoidable that certain philosophical and theological concepts will come up in the classroom, although you did note that there's enough to do just to teach the science. Do you think that perhaps there should be, as a professional philosopher, should there be philosophy in public schools that you might be able to treat such issues in a separate class?
You might, but I think that one has to be careful. That is, you might say, well, this class is going to be about philosophical issues, not scientific issues. But then one just has to figure out where the line is between philosophy and religion.
Yeah.
And what's I mean, can you do philosophical theology? I think the spirit of the amendment is you ought not to. And then you say, well, it's only philosophical. We're not reading the Bible. That doesn't. It's not a question of the Bible in the First Amendment. It's a question of religion. And when you begin talking about that, it becomes very sensitive. Go back to read the passage that of Lippmann about Jefferson's concern and Bryan's. I don't think evolution is teaching agnosticism, as Bryan thought, but the larger point that Lippmann made, it seems to me, is reasonable. There might be a few things that would be good parts of an education that ought to be left out of the public schools in order to avoid certain fights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's the political prudence of your presentation.
Yes.
A questioner wants to know about the teaching of evolution and the age at which it's appropriate. Should evolution be brought up at a particular level in order to best be understood in a scientific fashion and in a way in which the student can grasp the difference between the scientific questions at hand and the philosophical and or theological questions?
That is a difficult question, and one that I didn't fully address here. I mean, I imagine somebody objecting that these 8 points might be fine in principle, but high school students ready to understand them. And maybe I'm optimistic and say, yeah, high school students are right enough. They should be able to understand the main lines of those. But then, of course, you'd have the question, well, grade schoolers? You say, well, grade schoolers, it might be a harder matter. And so what are we gonna say about dinosaurs or about about evolution. I mean, one point that I might make, though it's not a full answer, is that it seems to me that that to, in a certain way, you want to bring up evolution as the answer to certain scientific questions, and not just present it as here it is, believe it, because all the scientists think it. I mean, in one sense, of course, it's reasonable to rely on the opinions of experts, and in another sense, the scientists are by and large the experts on these things. But I mean, one might say it'd be better in science classes lower down to focus on looking at nature and things like the biogeography, the difference in the flora and fauna in different parts of the world, and so on, and then come to evolution as a way to make sense of all these things, rather than just to present science as evolutionary biology as a given, as it were. I mean, I think the same thing about atoms and so on. One of the kind of odd things about teaching chemistry, I don't have any problem about the existence of atoms, but you begin the one of the chemistry book and it just talks about atoms and so on, and you say, I mean, you might say, how do we know that they're there? And there's a good answer to that, but it might be better as science education to talk about some of the phenomena that atoms make sense of, rather than just start by talking about them. That's, I suppose, a tension in grade school science, is how to handle any of these questions.
Yes, I mean, I've seen recently the curriculum at one school in which they sort of start at physics, and I suppose you sort of work your way to the more concrete sciences. But the way you're presenting it, it might be more helpful in certain ways to present those lower order sciences, and then the theory, present evolution as a theory, not meaning simply a hypothesis that's been thrown out there, but one that's been tested, that does account for certain facts in our physical world that we can actually touch and see and taste, first of all.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about the difference between coniferous and deciduous trees or something. How come there's a difference? But I mean, you can begin by just looking at how each one functions, how each one's a solution to the problems of being up north or not.
Yeah. All right, I have another question. This is a bit of a lengthy one, but we have a few minutes. Okay. An excellent presentation. I would have to review it in detail to absorb it all. But maybe you said this already, but the concern, as the questioner sees it, is not accommodating dissent from a religious point of view, but rather from a scientific one. What about academic freedom? Is evolution not still a theory, even if it's a fairly well attested one? In fact, it is a conjured one for the sole purpose of finding some answer for the existence of life that does not require God. It is not supported by the fossil record, see the Cambrian explosion, nor by molecular biology, nor by mathematical probability. Scientists may certainly post Darwin's theory as a possible explanation, but for it to be given such credence as to be unquestionable defies reason and goes against the basic principles of scientific inquiry. Darwin's theory is like saying the automobile evolved from the horse and buggy. St. Thomas could maybe say at least, maybe not. And presumably all other teachers should say that. I know there's a lot there, the Cambrian explosion, molecular biology, but how might you respond to that?
Well, yeah, as you say, it would take, we would have to talk a long time to cover each of the points. So let me try to pick a few. First, I did say and was explicit about the fallibility of science. No scientific theory is ever unquestionable in some strong sense of that word. Second, that I did say, and I think it's true, that it has achieved a broad consensus. I think the arguments are good. The questioner apparently thinks not. And so then we just have to ask the question, well, how should that be handled in the schools? And I mean, I'm repeating a couple of things, but I know I said a lot of things, so maybe they didn't come through very clearly before. I think that religion has strong constitutional protections for prudential reasons to avoid certain kinds of fights. Now, I don't think that philosophical or scientific reasons have that same kind of constitutional protection, and I don't think that grade school and high school teachers have individually academic freedom to teach whatever they think is right. I think that the government, the school board, has a right and a responsibility to make judgments about those things. And I don't think the judgment to spend time on evolutionary biology only and not alternative scientific theories, I think that judgment's a reasonable one. There's only a limited amount of time. It takes a lot of time to understand evolutionary biology, and one has to, as I said, talk about all of the things that it's supposed to explain. So I hope that covers a few of the main points. I realize that to cover each of them in detail, then you have to give me another 30 minutes, or maybe several times 30 minutes.
All right. Well, here's a question about the role of textbooks in scientific life. Textbooks now seem to play a role in determining who speaks for science to the public. Is this a new development historically? How is this a role that's perhaps maybe putting things in a more explicitly political lens, or how does this question work?
Well, do the textbooks determine who speaks for science? I think that'd be to say too much. I mean, the textbooks is just a thing. So it can't do it. So what have we been talking about? The publishers? Well, I mean, if the publishers publish something that nobody else takes seriously, nobody will buy the books. That'll be the end of that publishing house. So I really do think that neither the publishers nor the textbooks themselves are determining the scientific consensus. I think the scientific consensus emerges, and then people go look for textbooks that reflect it.
Perhaps a related question. A number of textbooks in fields like biology are written by those who are prominent new atheists, and have them. So is there a problem with that, using textbooks that may not be scientifically problematic, but bear a sort of new atheist imprimatur, thereby, say, Richard Dawkins or Peter Atkins or somebody like that?
I wasn't aware that Dawkins had written a scientific, that is a textbook in biology. Kenneth Miller has, and Kenneth Miller is certainly not an atheist. We'd have to look book by book to see how they're doing. In The War That Never Was, I did this for earlier periods, but didn't run up through the present, but did it through from the end of the 19th century and through the first half of the 20th century. And there can be certain problems there. I don't deny there was. I already mentioned the BBC, and it's sorry to run in the immaterial souls. Well, no, the BBC isn't quite a publisher, but you'd think that'd be kind of a place where, I mean, what's being proposed is here's a kind of a summary of the science, and it's more than just that. So I don't think it's problem free. I think the statement that I made is some kind of correction of that. If the statement contradicts the textbooks, well, I mean, the statement's right. I mean, that's my best view, is here's what the textbooks ought to say, the textbooks ought to acknowledge, though, or at least be consistent with. I mean, the textbook doesn't have to on evolutionary biology doesn't have to do some kind of philosophy of nature about the possibility of miracles and so on. But the statement might supplement them that way. And if the textbooks go astray, well, maybe the statement will correct them, at least in the student's mind.
All right. Well, we've run out of time now, but I'd like to thank you again, Ken, for your time. We've been speaking with Dr. Ken Kemp, a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas, and he's the author of The War That Never Was. It's available from Cascade Books. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it many places. We've been talking about a proposal for teaching evolution in schools and how to accommodate religious dissent. Thank you again, Ken, and thank you to all of our viewers. We'll have more webinars coming up. You can check our site at the Murphy Institute at stthomas.edu. I'd like you to have a great day. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your interest.